Why no contact affects avoidance more than you think. No contact is often misunderstood when it comes to avoidant people and avoidant relationships. Many people assume that avoidants simply move on quickly and never look back emotionally. They appear calm, detached, unaffected, and almost emotionally untouchable after a breakup or separation. And because of that outward behavior, many people believe no contact does absolutely nothing to them. But the truth is far more complicated beneath the surface. No contact often affects avoidance far more deeply than most people realize or understand. The difference is that avoidants process emotional pain very differently from emotionally expressive people. Their reactions are usually delayed, hidden, internalized, and emotionally suppressed for long periods of time. When the relationship first ends, avoidants often appear completely fine and emotionally relieved. In many cases, they may even seem happier, more social, or unusually independent after the separation. This can feel incredibly painful and confusing for the person they left behind. Because while you are grieving the emotional connection, they seem emotionally untouched by everything. But what many people fail to understand is this important psychological reality. Avoidants survive emotional pain by disconnecting from it rather than processing it directly. They suppress emotions instead of confronting them in real time. They distract themselves instead of sitting with emotional discomfort and vulnerability. So in the beginning, no contact can actually feel empowering for an avoidant person. The silence removes emotional pressure, expectations, accountability, and difficult conversations. For a short period of time, they may genuinely feel relieved by the distance and separation. It feels like they finally have room to breathe emotionally again. But eventually, something begins to change inside them. Because once the emotional pressure disappears completely, the emotional reality slowly starts catching up. And this is the stage most people never get to see. At first, avoidants are often focused on regaining control over their emotional space and independence. They may throw themselves into work, hobbies, socializing, or distractions to avoid deeper emotions. They convince themselves that the relationship was limiting, overwhelming, or emotionally demanding. And for a while, that story helps them maintain emotional distance from the pain. But no contact creates something that avoidants secretly struggle with more than they admit. It creates silence that they can no longer control emotionally. When you stop chasing, explaining, texting, or emotionally pursuing them, the dynamic suddenly changes in a way they are not prepared for psychologically. Because avoidants are often used to having emotional distance on their own terms. They are comfortable pulling away while still knowing the other person emotionally remains available. That emotional safety net gives them a hidden sense of control and reassurance. But no contact removes that safety net completely. And once they realize you are truly becoming emotionally unavailable, something shifts internally. Suddenly, the relationship no longer feels emotionally guaranteed to them. Your absence becomes real instead of temporary. And that is when avoidants often begin feeling emotions they previously suppressed or ignored. This is why many avoidants start thinking about you much later, rather than immediately. Their emotional processing tends to happen after distance, not during emotional intensity. While emotionally expressive people feel everything immediately, avoidants often feel it in reverse. At first, they feel relief. Then they feel curiosity. Then, confusion. Then, emotional emptiness begins creeping in quietly. They start remembering the emotional comfort you brought into their life. They remember your presence during lonely moments they once took for granted. They remember the emotional consistency they claimed they did not need. And slowly, the silence begins speaking louder than the relationship itself ever did. No contact affects avoidance deeply because it removes emotional access without conflict or drama. There is no argument left for them to emotionally react against. There is no pressure left for them to escape from anymore. There is only absence and emotional uncertainty. And uncertainty affects avoidance more than most people realize. Because beneath their independence is often a deep fear of emotional vulnerability and abandonment. They may not express that fear openly, but it still exists beneath the surface. The problem is that avoidants are trained to disconnect from emotional dependency. So instead of admitting they miss you, they often suppress the feeling again. Instead of reaching out honestly, they may become distant, indirect, or emotionally confusing. Some avoidants disappear completely while secretly thinking about you every single day. This is why no contact is powerful. Not because it manipulates the avoidant emotionally, but because it interrupts the unhealthy dynamic that allowed emotional avoidance to continue comfortably. When you stop chasing an avoidant, they are finally left alone with themselves emotionally. And that silence can become louder than any argument or emotional conversation ever was. For some avoidants, this silence becomes a moment of reflection and growth. They begin realizing how much emotional intimacy they avoided during the relationship. They start recognizing the patterns they blamed entirely on the other person. And in rare cases, they begin developing emotional self-awareness for the first time. But for other avoidants, the silence becomes something they run from again. Because facing unresolved emotions requires vulnerability and accountability. And vulnerability is exactly what avoidants fear the most internally. This is why you should never use no contact as a strategy to force someone back. Because the true purpose of no contact is not control or revenge. The true purpose is emotional healing, clarity, and reclaiming your own peace. And ironically, that emotional detachment is often what affects avoidance the most. Because once they realize you are no longer emotionally chasing them, they finally experience what true emotional distance actually feels like. And for many avoidants, that realization arrives much later than anyone expects.